In the Middle Ages, sieges of stone castles were won or lost by the ability to break those walls. The trebuchet was the ultimate castle crusher, a gigantic wooden machine that could hurl boulders with terrifying force. Powered by gravity, not just muscle, a trebuchet could launch rocks weighing hundreds of pounds over great distances. This weapon dominated medieval warfare for centuries, flattening towers and castles where arrows and ladders could not. Today, we trace the story of the trebuchet, from its invention through its greatest battles to the moment cannon fire took its throne. Origins and invention. The idea of throwing stones with a machine goes back to antiquity. Early forms of trebuchets, or mangonels, appeared in China by the 4th century BC, powered by teams of men pulling ropes to swing an arm. These simple traction trebuchets spread westward and were used by the Byzantines, Persians, Arabs, and others by the 6th to 7th centuries. But the dramatic breakthrough of medieval siege warfare was the counterweight trebuchet. By the 11th century, engineers on both sides of the Crusades had developed this new design. A large hinged arm, balanced by a heavy weight. Who exactly built the first great counterweight engine is lost to history. But by the 1180s, both Christian and Muslim armies were using it. An illustrated Arabic text from 1187 explicitly shows a counterweight trebuchet called the Persian engine in action. In Europe, the word trebuchet itself appears in records around 1200. By the 13th century, this weapon was common across Christendom and the Islamic world, even spreading back into China via the Mongols. In short, engineers took an old concept and turned it into a gravity-powered monster of wood and stone. Early uses in battle. Even before the famous heavy engines of later centuries, trebuchets shaped key medieval battles. During the Crusades, for example, both Muslims and Christian forces used them. In 1124 at the Siege of Tyre, Crusader chronicles note great trebuchets hurling stones at the city. By the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1191, the giant machines were everywhere. King Philip of France and Richard the Lionheart built massive stone throwers to batter the walls of Acre, shattering fortifications with wave after wave of rock. Richard's engineers even christened two of their machines God's Own Catapult and Bad Neighbour, the French name Malavoisin, to speak of their firepower. These engines helped bring down Acre's walls after a long, hard siege. In Europe itself, trebuchets appeared soon after. During England's Barons' War in 1217, the French Prince Louis brought a secret weapon to Dover Castle, a towering counterweight trebuchet nicknamed Malvoisin, evil neighbour. It was reportedly the first trebuchet ever used on English soil. Although it was huge, Dover's stout garrison held firm, and the engine accomplished little. Still, its presence showed that Europe was entering a new age of siegecraft. Over the next decades, nearly every war in Europe saw trebuchets deployed wherever castles stood. How a trebuchet works. A trebuchet is deceptively simple in principle, but terrifying in effect. Picture a massive wooden beam mounted on a pivot, the fulcrum. The beam is much longer on one side than the other. To the short end is attached a huge counterweight, often a box filled with rocks, sand, or lead. The long end carries a sling or cup to hold the projectile. To prepare a shot, soldiers pull the long arm down by winding ropes or turning a capstan, which raises the counterweight on the other side. Once fully cocked, the sling is loaded with a rock or other munition. At the signal, the lock is released and the counterweight crashes down. This plunging weight instantly flings the long arm upward. At the end of the swing, the sling whips forward and releases, launching its cargo in a high arc toward the target. The effect on the battlefield was spectacular. One well-documented engine with a 10-ton counterweight, about the weight of 5 cars, could send a 300-pound stone nearly 300 yards before it plummeted into the wall it was aimed at. In other words, a boulder weighing as much as a grown man could sail 3 football fields and still smash through stone. Lighter but still massive crews on smaller trebuchets could fling 100 to 200-pound rocks hundreds of meters. By comparison, an earlier torsion catapult might only launch a 25 to 40-pound projectile, a fraction of that distance. Even more striking, some legendary machines are said to have hurled stones of 600 kilograms, nearly 1,300 pounds, or more, truly wall-busting ammunition. Trebuchets could fire more than just raw rocks. Engineers adapted them to every purpose of siege warfare. Round boulders were the most common, aiming to smash masonry with blunt force, but crews also launched wooden beams, metal shards, or sharpened wooden stakes to set fires and tear through timber. In many sieges, defenders dreaded a flaming projectile or pot of hot oil hurtling over the walls. In the cruel realm of psychological warfare, trebuchets would sometimes launch crushed animal carcasses, rotting refuse, or even the bodies of plague victims. This gruesome tactic aimed to spread disease and terror among those inside the walls. Whether firing 300-pound cannonballs of stone or hurling filth at the enemy, the trebuchet was a versatile bombardment tool, the artillery of its age. Famous medieval sieges. Trebuchets took center stage in many dramatic sieges. One of the most famous is the Siege of Acre, 1189 to 1191, during the Third Crusade. As Crusader armies encircled the city held by Saladin, engineers constructed wave after wave of siege engines. King Richard's own forces deployed the enormous machines nicknamed God's Own Catapult and Bad Neighbor. Day and night, these trebuchets pounded at Acre's walls. Each thunderous impact tore chunks out of the ramparts and sent defenders scrambling to plug the breach. After 2 years of siege, the walls finally gave way, and the city surrendered. In England, another legendary siege was the Great Blockade of Kenilworth Castle in 1266. King Henry III's army laid siege to Simon de Montfort's stubborn fortress during the Barons' Wars. Eyewitness chronicles describe dozens of stone throwers on both sides. One vivid scene unfolds when the Royalists raised a huge wooden siege tower called the Bear, bristling with archers. But inside Kenilworth, a defender had secretly built a mangonel. This hidden trebuchet began lobbing boulders at the Bear with such ferocity that the tower was smashed. In the words of the chronicle, it lost its ability to deliver and inflict damage after repeated shots from the counter-inside artillery. The Royals' largest tower was reduced to ruin by just one stone-throwing engine on the wall. This incident shows how trebuchets could even turn the tables in close combat. The defenders used one to destroy the attacker's weapon. Ultimately, the siege dragged on for months until hunger and disease forced a surrender. Not all trebuchet battles had such vengeance. In 1217 at Dover Castle, French forces brought the massive Malvoisin against King Henry III's young son's stronghold. The enormous counterweight engine was set up under cover of night and rained shot on Dover's gate. Villagers reported that each hit sent splinters flying and rattled the castle, but the stout English defenders quickly repaired the damage. For 10 days, Dover's defenders held out, even as Malvoisin hammered day and night. In the end, word arrived that a relief force had defeated the besiegers elsewhere, and Louis lifted the siege with his trebuchet unspent. Dover's example showed that even great siege engines were not invincible. Strong garrisons and clever repairs could blunt their effect. One more dramatic trebuchet tale comes from Scotland. In 1304, during the Wars of Independence, King Edward I of England was besieging Stirling Castle, the last rebel holdout. Frustrated by the stout resistance, Edward commissioned the largest war machine the world had seen. When built, the great engine, nicknamed the Warwolf or Loup de Guerre, required 30 wagons of wood and months of work by hundreds of carpenters. According to chronicles, the Warwolf's first bolt flew like an arrow through cloth, punching through 2 stout walls in succession. The Scots were so shaken by the beast's might that they surrendered before it could be fully tested. Whether every detail of this story is legend or fact, it captures the terrifying reputation trebuchets held. A single shot from such a monster could topple stone walls as if they were paper. These examples are just a few of many. From the Crusader castles of the Holy Land to the baronial conflicts of England, from French fortresses to Highland castles, the trebuchet was the weapon that attackers and defenders alike feared most. Wherever a wall needed tearing down, trebuchets played a role in medieval sieges. Tactical and psychological impact. The trebuchet did more than physically smash walls. It changed how wars were fought. Tactically, it shifted sieges from infantry assaults to bombardments. Before trebuchets, attacking armies might simply try to storm gates or mine under walls. With trebuchets, they could stand safely beyond bow range and pound at the masonry. Damaged walls could be repaired between shots, but continuous bombardment forced defenders to split attention between repairing, fighting off sappers, and watching for more assault. A well-served trebuchet could plaster a breach in minutes and then reload without risking the operators. This firepower had a huge psychological effect. A single trebuchet shot made a deafening crash as it hit, and dust and stone would shower everywhere. Watching massive boulders smash apart battlements or plow through towers was terrifying. Soldiers cowered behind whatever cover they could find while defenders clung to their lives and the hope that the walls would hold. Chroniclers often noted that even rumours of a great siege engine on the horizon could prompt a city to negotiate rather than test its fate. In one case, just the assembling of Edward's Warwolf was enough to convince Stirling's garrison to surrender. Defenders adapted by trying to minimise the engine's effect. They built earthen reinforcements behind critical walls or sank obstacles around the castle base to spoil attackers' aim. They might attack an enemy trebuchet with archers or counterfire from their own machines. Indeed, great sieges often became contests of counterweights, who could build more or bigger trebuchets. But the attackers generally enjoyed the advantage. Trebuchets could often outrange the defenders' smaller catapults, and as long as they were protected by their own walls or a ditch, trebuchet crews could work relatively safely. For the besieged, the presence of trebuchets was demoralizing. Imagine the terror of a city's inhabitants seeing each day's horizon darkened by a monster wooden frame scraping across a hill toward them. Each thunderous impact shattered window panes and shook their rooms. Sometimes whole sections of walls crumbled under the onslaught. When engines launched rotting carcasses or flaming pitch, fear of fire and disease spread as fast as the contagion itself. The defenders often felt boxed in by time. Every day meant more damage and the threat of starvation or surrender. In short, trebuchets brought the siege inescapably home to those inside. On the other side, building and operating a trebuchet was a feat of engineering and organization. Kings and generals poured resources into making bigger engines, hoping to break stalemates. A victorious trebuchet not only took walls, it took morale. Songs and poems of the age often bragged about the stone rain that such engines could unleash. In practical terms, castles became more vulnerable. Many castles were rebuilt with rounder towers and multiple layers to resist bombardment. Thus, even the design of fortifications began to change in response to the trebuchet's power. Decline in the age of gunpowder. The trebuchet's reign lasted from roughly the 12th through the 14th centuries. After that, its fortunes waned with the rise of gunpowder. Early cannons began appearing in Europe by the 14th century, and by the 15th, these iron guns could hurl shot with frightening effect. Cannonballs did not require huge wooden frameworks and crews. They could often penetrate walls more quickly than a siege engine that took hours to reload. As fortresses in turn were refortified to resist artillery, with thicker sloping walls and star forts, the massive timber trebuchet had fewer places to shine. By the 1400s, gunpowder artillery had generally taken over siege warfare. Trebuchets became rare outside places that lacked metal smithing. In fact, one of the very last recorded uses of a large trebuchet was by the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés in 1521 during the siege of Tenochtitlan. Cortés, accustomed to Spanish arms, even built a giant stone thrower to bombard the Aztecs, an echo of medieval Europe on the other side of the world. But this was a historical curiosity. Shortly after, firearms and cannons dominated every battlefield. In essence, the trebuchet was a medieval marvel that ran its course. By the time of the Renaissance, white powder artillery had made wooden giants obsolete. With no further use on the battlefield, trebuchets disappeared into legend. Yet for the centuries of its use, it reshaped warfare. It was the artillery piece of the Middle Ages, and its thunderous power left a legacy in every castle, ruin it shattered. The age of gunpowder had arrived, but as the last stone flew from that Spanish siege, the medieval trebuchet gracefully ceded the stage to the cannon.